Fab. So, hello everyone, welcome. If you're joining us from the previous slide event on conflict emissions, hello again, and thank you for staying with us. If you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, then hello. My name is Ellie Kinney. I'm Climate Advocacy Coordinator at the Conflict and Environment Observatory, and I have the privilege today of moderating this panel, Transparent Military Emissions Reporting and the Path to Military Decarbonisation. I want to start by firstly acknowledging the worsening geopolitical situation outside of these walls. We are about to have a very technical and I hope very positive conversation about how defence can drive forward decarbonisation, but I think it feels appropriate to begin this session by really thinking about the human side of this intersection. People affected by the climate crisis, people affected by armed conflicts, and the people facing both of these interconnected issues combined. I've been at COP here for a few days now, and I've been involved in this space for a few years now. And I think to me, the message gets painfully clearer day by day. The climate crisis is here, and we need whole society decarbonisation if we are to limit warming to 1.5 degrees to secure a livable future for all. No one should be left behind, and everyone has a part to play. But to date, this hasn't been the case. In the UNFCCC, we focus on high-emitting sectors like shipping and aviation to ensure that there is both pressure from civil society and the political will from policymakers to drive decarbonisation in these sectors. And yet the military's contribution to global emissions is about the same as both of these sectors combined. And yet defence is very rarely included in these conversations. It has managed so far to avoid the spotlight of the climate movement, but I think now the spotlight seems to be growing brighter and brighter every day. Militaries have a critical role to play in decarbonisation. They cannot and they should not be exempt from action, and this starts at the fundamental level of reporting. And what you'll hear from our speakers this afternoon is the case for why transparent military emissions reporting is such a crucial foundation for decarbonisation. And importantly, first-hand experience of how militaries are already making this change. So we're going to hear from each of our speakers, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please do have a think of what you'd like to ask of our panelists. You'll still understand the kind of scale and the range of expertise that we have here with us. So I hope you're ready to utilise this. And for our first expert, I am very pleased to introduce my colleague, Linsey Cottrell. Linsey is the Environmental Policy Officer at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. She's a chartered environmentalist and has worked in the environmental consultancy sector for 25 years before she joined CEOBS in 2019. Here, Linsey has worked on military greenhouse gas emissions and supporting the integration of environmental protection in humanitarian disarmament programs. And she's here to pass on some of her knowledge on the topic of military emissions. So it's over to you, Linsey.
Thank you very much, Ellie. You can hear me okay, I take it? I apologise again, I can't get my camera to work for some reason, but never mind, I might manage to do it later. So good evening, and thank you for joining us. As Ellie mentioned, the climate impacts of conflicts has been discussed earlier, covered in the preceding side event today. And we're now going to focus on military greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's important to make sure that we distinguish between the two. Military emissions, of course, relate to those emissions from day-to-day activities and from their supply chain. Can you move to the next slide, please, Ellie? I can't actually see these slides, but never mind.
You'll have to trust me, Linsey. Yeah. I've moved the slides.
So first, a really brief introduction to my organisation, the Conflict and Environment Observatory. We're a UK charity working to increase the protection of people and ecosystems from the impact of armed conflicts and military activities. So in 2021, we set up the Military Emissions Gap website. You see the link there. And we did that with colleagues from the universities of Durham and Lancaster in the UK. And this was to highlight this lack of data and the need for much better understanding and transparency around the military's own contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please, Ellie. So our focus on military missions is important since they remain hugely dependent upon and huge consumers of fossil fuels. And until recently, as Ellie mentioned, armed forces around the globe have largely been exempt from any discussion even on reducing their own emissions. But this has been changing. In 2021, the then NATO Secretary General did say that there's no way to reach net zero without also including emissions from the military. And last June, he reiterated the need to reduce the substantial emissions from military activities. Unlike his predecessor, who attended previous COPs, the new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, is not attending this COP. And time will tell where this remains on NATO's agenda. And we can't afford this to slip down the list of priorities. Hopefully, with NATO's new Centre of Excellence on climate change, this slippage won't happen. But one problem we do have is that the context on how military and climate change is often discussed, there's quite an imbalance. There's a lot of discussion around climate security and adaptation, so where and how wars are fought and protecting military assets. And there is much less about mitigating the military's own impact on the climate. Next slide, please, Ellie. So as well as NATO, we also have the European Defence Agency's Deputy Chief Executive reiterating the importance of including the defence sector in meeting net zero targets. However, the military is rarely mentioned in specific climate action progress reports. For example, the EU's Climate Action Progress Report for 2024 mentions that the EU has been working with NATO and the OSCE to increase engagement on the impact of climate change on peace, security and defence, but it doesn't mention about the impact of the military on the environment and the need for them to reduce their emissions. So the EU community is continuing with its climate change and defence roadmap, which started in 2020, and next year, so in 2025, there is an intermediate review of this, and there should be a general review in 2030 at the very latest. So for Europe at least, hopefully next year will be a really useful review point. Next slide, please, Ellie. So we know that global expenditure has reached an all-time high last year, increasing to $2.4 trillion. And this, of course, means it's more vital than ever that we see improvements in understanding where the military emissions are, and we see concrete measures to reduce them. And research suggests that military build-ups inevitably result in total emissions increasing and emission intensities increasing, and this will impede any green transition. So for a 1% increase in military spending, it's estimated that total emissions will increase by between 0.9% and 2%. But there's an overall lack of visibility on what the total contribution is, and that's because the global data sets are either absent or they're really obscured. So military emissions data is submitted, but only on a voluntary basis to the UNFCCC. So that means, of course, that not all countries are doing so. And last year we just saw 4 countries submitting data in line with the UNFCCC requests on military fuel use. And the remaining data that's there is often incomplete, or it's amalgamated with other categories, and it's not actually possible to see where the military's contribution is. This year, of course, there's a delay in submissions of greenhouse gas inventories. And of the few countries that have submitted theirs already, we're not really seeing any improvements in this. Some of the surprises, like Japan, for example, they're the 10th largest military budget in the world. They're not submitting any data at all, even though they've acknowledged that this is a requirement in country. And generally, there's no useful data being provided by non-Annex 1 countries, and this is despite many of them having huge military expenditure. One welcome exception, actually, this year, Singapore have submitted their data, and they have for the first time provided mobile fuel use data. And they've actually acknowledged the need for much better transparency. So that's one good move forward. So with the revisions of the data, we usually update our website every year around this time of year, but we'll be doing that in early 2025 once all the submission data is in. Next slide, please, Ellie. So the 5.5% figure that you may have frequently heard quoted about military's contribution to global emissions, if we use that 5.5% estimate, it means that militaries, if it was a country, would have the 4th highest carbon footprint in the world. But of course, the problem with this is it is just an estimate. And you'll be hearing later from how Norway and Slovenia are already getting a much better understanding of their emissions, but that's not the same for all militaries, and many militaries don't know or don't acknowledge their total emissions, and there's just not enough currently done with respect to measuring and reporting them. Last year also, the United Nations Environment Programme's emissions gap report, which they publish every year, did mention this lack of data, but disappointingly this year it doesn't mention anything at all, despite we're not really seeing any substantial improvements. Next slide, please, Ellie. So even if the UNFCCC data that's being asked for was complete, this is only asking for fuel use data, and it still wouldn't give us the full picture. So we need consolidated reporting in country, and we do need a real overhaul of the UNFCCC reporting categories. And that's because militaries, of course, have these large and very complex supply chains, and we know that emissions from supply chains, so this is the scope 3, far exceed an organisation's own emissions. And a large proportion of a military's annual emissions are going to be down to its supply chain and not necessarily the scope 1 and the scope 2, so that's the fuel use and the energy use itself. Next slide, please, Ellie. So I apologise for this rather complicated picture, but it's a bit busy. But this gives a picture of what total military emissions are made up from. The framework highlights the key categories. If you just click again, please, Ellie. So militaries at the top there generally reporting scope 1 and scope 2, so those are the ones at the top, and very few are reporting the scope 3, which are the upstream and downstream supply chain emissions. This isn't surprising, but we know improvements are needed. For example, in Europe, it's estimated around about 37% of scope 3 emissions are only being considered in business decarbonisation measures, and scope 3 emissions are really important to understand where there's a need for prioritisation and action, and it's not a mandatory reporting requirement in many countries. So there's not any consistency across militaries on reporting, although steps have started to improve because last year NATO did publish their greenhouse gas methodology, and that does include scope 3 requirements. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I just wanted to give you this list, which gives an indication of some of the breadth of research activity which is underway in NATO. This includes, for example, the one there, 182 on the effects of climate change and security, 184, which is the carbon footprint assessment, and there's a host of others there on low carbon technologies. This is encouraging. We must keep an eye on the outputs from these, but also for any carbon reduction strategies, just to reiterate again, the importance obviously of measuring and reporting on the manner of their effectiveness and their progress and the full life cycle of emissions from these. Next slide, please, Ellie. And because most military mitigation policies are actually in their fairly early stages of implementation, it's important that they're scrutinised wherever possible. The UNFCCC guidance on credible net zero commitments highlights the importance of making timely and meaningful contributions to reduce emissions, and also about publishing annual progress reports against interim and long-term targets. So military reporting, which is now emerging, needs to align with international good practice. And there are 5 essential and very familiar requirements for reporting, namely to be relevant, to be comprehensive, consistent, accurate and transparent. And of course, this applies to the military. And without this common reporting, you can't compare between militaries, and it's very difficult to judge performance. Next slide, please, Ellie. So we're seeing more countries producing reports, which is really positive. But to reiterate, we need consistency, and we need the expectation well, the acceptance, sorry, that this doesn't mean that it's going to impede on national security, which is some of the arguments that we've heard. We need them to cover scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions where they're material and relevant, and of course scope 3 plus, which is what you heard before with respect to conflict related emissions where that's relevant. Next slide please, Ellie. And this year, of course, we're seeing the update to countries' national determined contributions for the deadline early next year. We know that successive NDCs need to be progressive and they need to reflect the highest possible ambition. And currently, NDCs don't actually include any mention of the military or the need for mitigation from the military. And this, we believe, is a significant omission and fails to show full commitment, and especially the case where you've got countries that have already set out explicit need for their militaries to do something about their greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, we know that there's need for better transparency in reporting, and we know this is possible. We need some basic steps being taken, like improving the mandatory requirements to the UNFCCC on providing military fuel use data. Several militaries already do this, so it's not a problem because they're already collecting and reporting this data in country. And if militaries aren't providing this information, there's no proper understanding of where carbon budget sits and climate-related decisions around them. Please do check your country's new NDC and their commitments for 2035. We need to make sure that military reduction strategies and progress towards these are properly scrutinised. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linsey. I think that's a really, really good starting point for this event. Thank you for giving us such a comprehensive overview. So next we'll turn to Colonel Robert Šipec, who is Energy Efficiency and Green Transition Division Head at the Ministry of Defence of the Republic of Slovenia. The division carries out technical, expert and analytical tasks relating to increasing energy efficiency, reducing the emissions footprint, increasing energy self-sufficiency and autonomy, and introducing renewable and alternative energy sources. Therefore, he is well placed to share with us his experience in leading his department in the calculation of a carbon footprint of the Ministry of Defence, and to explain the role that accounting plays in the Ministry's decarbonisation efforts. Thank you. Clicker.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ellie, for your introduction. Yes. I come from a smaller country with relatively small armed forces, but very well developed capabilities in all military domains. The Ministry and the armed forces are committed to actively contribute to common environmental goals. But I should point at the beginning that with the green transition of the defense sector, the country's defense capabilities must not be compromised. So we carried out the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions together with scientists from the University of Ljubljana, following the standard protocols for scope 1, 2 and also 3. The calculation serves us mainly as a mirror of our organization and less for comparison with other ministries of defense or armed forces, as differences in size, tasks, scopes, equipment and so on make this almost impossible. The calculation points us to critical areas where we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions quickly, or we need more effort and time to do so. As an example, you can see there where is the arrow. In the first half of 2018, we requested a transition from the national energy mix to green energy for electricity use only. The result is in a reduction of more than 10% in the organization's overall emissions. And that was only through the procurement process. The requirement for data collection and transparent reporting on greenhouse gas emissions was set out by our minister as part of the long-term guidelines for increasing climate resilience, also known as climate change mitigation strategy. The strategy also implies an action plan for green transition towards a zero-emission organization by 2050. The action plan is already in place. In recent years, we have been intensively renovating buildings to near zero emission buildings and building new buildings according to the zero emission standards. We are introducing renewable sources and alternative fuels like photovoltaics and hydrogen. Then we are adopting sustainable transport. And what is also very important, allocating a significant portion of the research and development budget to green technologies. Overall, we find out that the green transition activities are improving defense capabilities and not weakening the capabilities already in place. We should also say that cooperation is essential to achieve the objectives and common goals. Cooperation is important both domestically and internationally. At national level, we work with other governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and above all, research organizations and industry. To this purpose, we set up the Slovenian Energy and Environment Partnership in Defense a few years ago between Ministry of Defense and an industrial association. At international level, we are actively involved in activities of United Nations, NATO, and the EU, and other international alliances and networks. Of particular note is the Consultation Forum for Sustainable Energy in the Defense and Security sector, which is the largest defense energy-related forum in Europe, where experts from all EU defense ministries exchange ideas, good practices, and set up joint projects. In order to correctly assess greenhouse gas emissions in the military sector in accordance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, extensive data analysis is required. Data and emission factors are generally available for Scope 1 and 2, but we encounter major challenges in Scope 3, where data may be missing, and in some categories, emission factors are also not available or not applicable to the military sector, especially for purchased military equipment and ammunition. The left figure represents Scope 3 of greenhouse gas emissions of Ministry of Defense, excluding a portion of purchased ammunition and some military equipment, where uncertainty of data and emissions factor is such that it could mispresent the results. But we can see also on that figure that there are a very good area for improvement, and this is the daily commuting to job and back, and for sure this is thing that we can improve in the future. So in conclusion, data and emissions factors for Scope 1 and 2 are generally available, so that the armed forces can calculate and report the emissions. The resulting emissions are a mirror that allows the organization to plan its decarbonization activities. By doing that, defense capabilities cannot be harmed. In many cases, defense capabilities can be improved by green transition approach. Cooperation between countries, industry and research organizations is paramount to making the green transition more effective. And for sure, the further work on the data collection and emissions factor is needed for purpose of transparent military emission reporting and military decarbonization. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's really great to hear how this journey has started out for Slovenia, and yeah, we're excited to see how we can see you leading the way in the future. Just to flag for the tech guys, it's been flagged to me that people following online can't see both the slides and the speaker. I wonder if that could be changed, if possible. In our next speaker, we'll hear from an organisation who really have been a leader in military emissions reporting for a number of years now. Simen Kirkhorn is a researcher at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment and is leading the environmental reporting and greenhouse gas inventory of the Norwegian Ministry of Defence, as well as research on climate mitigation measures within the defence context. Simen has a background in renewable energy studies and natural resource management and is currently a PhD candidate at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. I'm pleased that Simen is here today to talk us through Norway's extensive experience of emissions reporting and how this can be used to look to the future.
Well, thank you so much, Ellie. Starting off. Okay, here we go. Okay. Yeah, so I have two main messages for my presentation here. One being that we have conducted a greenhouse gas inventory for the Norwegian defense sector, the Norwegian MOD, for quite a few years now, since 2012. And the second message is that we've started doing work on the, I would say, the next logical step, which is not only having data on the greenhouse gases currently, but also to project emissions into the future. What will they be, and how can we mitigate those emissions? Okay, so I've divided the presentation into four main sections. First, an introduction, then showing you the greenhouse gas inventory, show you our work on emission forecasting, and finally, I will provide a QR code for our action plan on defense and climate and environment. Okay, so yeah, we've been doing this work for quite some time, and we really have a good overview of all the data because we have had an ongoing project for many years, actually starting around 1999 on the environmental database for the defense sector. For many years, data was collected, as you can see on the slide here, energy use in buildings, fuel use, use of ammunition, and deposition of heavy metals in shooting ranges, waste, water, chemicals, spills, and also greenhouse gas inventory. So the main functions of this database is to provide data to the public, to be transparent about environmental footprints, but also secondly, importantly, to be an important source for efficient environmental management, that we can monitor our emissions and see how they develop over time and set targets. So based on this data and other data, we've compiled a greenhouse gas inventory since 2012. And the inventory is according to the greenhouse gas protocol. I will not go into detail on that protocol, but essentially it's an internationally recognized method to report business or organizational emissions. So emissions are divided into three scopes. Scope 1 are emissions caused directly by the Norwegian defense sector, local heating emissions, and also fuel use, mainly from the Navy and the Air Force. We have Scope 2 emissions, which are purchased electricity and remote heating and cooling services. And then Scope 3 emissions, which is pretty much all other indirect emissions. So you can see some of the categories here: the leased resources for the MOD, waste handling, all the business travels, transportation, production of the fuel that is used, and importantly, the most important category, which I will come back to, all the procured goods and services each year. So this is the result, going back 5 years' time for the total greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1 emissions, approximately 230,000 tons, or 18%. Scope 2, just 1%. I will come back to why that is a low, why these are so low. And the most important category, which is Scope 3 emissions, 81% of total emissions are here. So this totals for 2023, 1.3 million tons of CO2 equivalents. Okay, now we'll go to each one of these scopes. First of all, we have Scope 1. We clearly see that most emissions are from the vessels and the aircrafts. Approximately 90% of all emissions, all direct Scope 1 emissions, are from these sources. Comparatively, military vehicles and non-military land vehicles use they use fuel as well, but much smaller quantities than the Navy and the Air Force. There are very low emissions from buildings. The reason being that there used to be high emissions from heating oil, but this is phased out and replaced by wood chips, which are renewable. For Scope 2 emissions, these emissions are much smaller in Norway. The reason for this, the two main sources are electricity and district heating and cooling. And the reason for these emissions being low is the use of renewable energy in Norway, mainly hydropower and wind, and also imports from other countries, which is baked into the emission factor. But nevertheless, small emissions, low emissions from use of electricity. But there are two ways to see this or to calculate greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. There are also a market-based method. This is essentially systems like guarantees of origin, where you can buy claims that your electricity comes from a renewable source. The MOD in Norway has not done this, so we need to report higher emissions in a market-based factor. So scholars debate always what is a good, what types of emission factors to use and report Scope 2, but the protocol solves this issue by being totally transparent, reporting both types of emissions. And moving to Scope 3, remembering earlier slides, these are clearly the largest sources of emissions, 81% of emissions. Some colleagues of mine did a study a couple of years ago where we combined data that we already had in our greenhouse gas inventory with procurement data and an economic modeling assessment on emissions. So essentially, this methodology is called environmental extended input-output assessment. What this essentially means is that economic flows in the economy are modeled, and we have data on government spending in large procurement categories, and for the same categories we have average emission factors associated with purchases for that category. I will show you the results because our greenhouse gas inventory changed quite a lot when we gathered this data. On the left-hand side in 2021, emission was much lower, as you can see. I would say there was a good precision in the data, high-quality data, but of course a lower accuracy because we didn't have an estimate at all on procurement emissions. On the right-hand side, we do have that. The economic modeling is more uncertain, so there's less precision in the data, but the accuracy is considerably higher. Yeah, and as you can see, clearly Scope 3 emissions are the largest source of emissions. Now I'll switch over to talk about our work on emission forecasting. We started doing this in 2019. And this is really important, right? Because we don't only want to have an account of what are the greenhouse gas emissions for a given year, we also know how will they develop into the future, and given the current planning, and how can we mitigate those emissions. So this is a preliminary calculation. It can change quite a lot, but this is based on the best data we have available. And for Norway, there will be a large increase in government spending on the defense, procuring more vessels, aircrafts, more battalions in the army. So it will expand and also use the existing platforms more. And we expect emissions to increase due to this, but it's not a given. The figure is based on using only fossil fuel, as we have done. Okay. And we are also starting doing some work on mitigation modeling as well. And here we see technological trends really going in both directions, I would say. Generally, more newer equipment and platforms are more energy efficient. The use of simulators can really cut back on emissions if it replaces live training on large platforms. And yeah, we have one example here for maritime demining operations. This is a new concept that will be implemented in a few years in Norway. And it's essentially using autonomous surface vessels and autonomous subsea drones that can detect and make mines go off at sea much more efficiently and using less energy. So it's both a more capable platform, but at the same time reducing emissions quite a lot, by 80%. Okay, so this is the final slide. You can grab your phones and scan the QR code. This is, I don't have time to go into details on the Norwegian defense sector climate and environmental strategy, but you can read and have a look. It's a strategy, but there is also an action plan following this strategy. So the take-home message is that we do have a long experience with compiling data for a greenhouse gas inventory, and second, which is critical, the next logical step is to do emission forecasting as well and do mitigation modeling. And I'd also add that, just as Robert said, that for militaries generally, no one is interested in compromising on operational control capabilities, but this is not really the case. There are plenty of opportunities to cut back on emissions while still ensuring operational efficiency and capabilities. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Brilliant, thank you, Simon. Yeah, really appreciate the knowledge that you're able to share on reporting, which I hope others will be able to learn from, although hopefully not to follow the increases in emissions that may happen. So now moving on from our defence sector colleagues, I'd like to introduce just some of the growing civil society voices on this issue. Firstly, we're joined by Dr. Gabriela Manea, who is a Principal Programme Manager in the Policy and Research Division at DCAF, the Geneva Centre for Security Sector Governance. There, she oversees policy research in the field of emerging security challenges, in particular climate change and its implications for security sector governance and reform, as well as comparative research on post-war security sector reform in several countries. She's joining to share how DCAF has been working on climate change and security sector governance and reform, and to explore the kind of issues that countries should consider when they're developing frameworks for accountable and effective climate-related action by the national security sector.
So hello. Thank you, Ellie, for inviting me in this to contribute to this very interesting and timely panel. I think, first of all, I would like to say a few words about my organizations for those of you who don't know anything about DCAF. DCAF comes from Democratic Control of Armed Forces. It was the first acronym of my organization, which now is called Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. It started work around 24 years ago, and focused first on the transformation processes in the defense sector in Eastern and Central Europe, in the process of integration in NATO and the EU, and then it has continued to develop its scope in terms of content as well as geography. So my organization is now working basically on all continents. And has also field offices, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Manea region, and Europe and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. What is specific about my organization is the fact that we take a governance approach. So we are interested in looking into military affairs, but also in other actors of the security sector, like police forces, intelligence, border guards, and so on, but in a very comprehensive way. So we do not only look at the actors, at the security providers themselves, but we also we also integrate the management institutions in the security field, as well as the oversight actors. Actually, the oversight dimension is very important for DCAF. That is also the approach that we take when we have decided to look into the so-called emerging security challenges, under which climate change and climate security stands out as one of the most important, if not the most important. And we did work in two areas, in two directions. First of all, in terms of going into some kind of empirical work into the field to look into the roles of the various security sector actors, including the military, but also the police, in various countries, like for instance in Brazil or in Palestine, and other case studies that we have had. So looking into their contributions to disaster risk management or environmental crime, for instance, but also from a gender perspective to see how, to what extent the security sector can integrate into its own way of operation on the ground gender aspects as well. At another level of our work, we also try to develop a framework that would enable the defense sector and the other security sector actors to have a very comprehensive strategic approach in terms of their role in global climate governance at the international and at national level. And for that, we have partnered up with UN Department for Peace Operations and within this organization with UNFCCC unit, and have developed a guideline which creates basically a framework for that. So our objectives are to basically raise awareness about the impact and possible contributions that the security sector and especially the military can have on global and national climate governance. We also want to advocate for urgent action to mainstream climate action in security sector governance and reform in 4 areas of actions. In the mitigation, adaptation, response, and cooperation. And we want to also share examples of what they need to do differently in the future in order to be better prepared to help communities and states to navigate the challenges of the climate crisis. And of course, we also think that for helping the defense sector, especially in countries that are in development, transition, or conflict affected, it would be important to have a global green SSR fund, and we are advocating for this as well. So, we base our work on 3 principles. One is accountability and effectiveness of security provision, then it's preparedness and strategic planning, and the third one is creating transparent targets for mitigation and adaptation within the security sector and in particular defense sector. The framework that we have developed in cooperation with the UNFCCC unit, it's, as I said, looks in a comprehensive way, not only at the mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation measures, response, but also cooperation, what was mentioned before by my, Victor? Robert, yeah. Which we also think it's very important that the national security sectors starts cooperating with one another and exchange best practices and methodologies. Yeah, so now I will not go into the other categories and the other pathways, but I will just stick to the mitigation, which is the topic of this panel. And within mitigation, we also have done our desk research, which relies very much on primary research that has been that exists outside there. And we also found out that the military has a very and the defense sector has a very heavy footprint on climate warming, and that this is very differentiated across the world. So we need to take this into account, that some militaries have higher contributions than others. We also think, and that this carbon footprint comes from, of course, from activities and infrastructure of the military in the peacetime, but as well in the conflict context. But and that basically trainings, war games, weapon testing, waste, including the nuclear test, has an importance, have a role to play in this impact that the security sector and the defense in particular has on mitigation. Another area in which we think the defense sector and security sector at large is involved or has an impact is on environmental conservation. We think it can it has basically a mixed record in terms of its impact on environmental conservation and on the prevention of environmental and climate-related crime. Therefore, there is a lot of space for them to innovate and to reform in that in this area. We think that the police forces do a little bit better in terms of striving for carbon neutrality and zero GHG emissions, because they are much more involved into the state reporting on climate emissions, but that the military is, of course, doing much less well. We also think that one important aspect is the fact that the militaries do not, the emissions from the military are not part of the nationally determined contributions and of national adaptation plans, that reporting is voluntary, and that data, when available, is not always, it's selective and sometimes inconsistent, and therefore it's difficult to have, to establish global and regional trends. And we are also aware that armed conflicts have a huge impact on GHG emissions, which is not accounted at all in the current global reporting system, which is nevertheless a voluntary one. What we've also found out in our research is that in terms of security management, security oversight institutions, that when such initiatives for mitigation exist in the security sector and in the defense sector, they are very much led by executive, by governments and parliaments, as well as other oversight bodies are very literally involved in these initiatives, and we think that this needs to change, and that Parliament should become much more involved in monitoring and making sure that that defense sector and the security sector at large is abiding to climate action. I will not go through the other slides because they are not important for now. And I will just go straight to some of the options for actions that we are promoting. So we think that it's in fact not very accurate to just blame the military itself or the defense sector, because they are actually not alone. They exist in a political context, and in most of the countries of the world, militaries are actually under civilian control in a way or another, even in authoritarian regimes. So that's why I think that states have the responsibility to make sure that the defense sector is moving on the right path in terms of climate mitigation. So they need to run assessments to determine priorities for their security sector's mitigation. They need to review and enact new laws that hold security institutions accountable for national climate mitigation strategies, goals, and plans. There is also a need of a more capacity building of oversight institutions in the security landscape, formal and informal ones, which can ensure accountability, compliance, and consistency with the climate targets that will be decided by each state individually. They need to take action on reducing the environmental footprint, the GHG emissions, and the impact on climate warming, including through carbon neutral technology. For that, cooperation with research institutions and other epistemic communities is also very important. I will stop here. And
can I pitch my laptop back?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. That was, really comprehensive, and I think very good to end on these really concrete actions that we can take. Lastly, I am pleased to introduce our final speaker, Thea Uhlich. Thea is a policy advisor for low carbon strategies and energy in the field of international climate policy at German Watch, a German environment and development organization. She is a co-author of the Climate Change Performance Index, the CCPI, and each year the CCPI tracks and compares the climate change mitigation performance of 63 countries and the EU. But so far, the lack of transparent data means that military missions are not considered in this analysis, something that I hope we can change very soon. Thea, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation to this panel. And in the next 11 minutes, there are a few more. In the next 11 minutes, I will introduce you to the CCPI, and I will also try to explain why sufficient and comprehensive data are important for our work, and therefore why closing the military mission gap is important to our work. So the CCPI basically is a country ranking, as you said, Ellie, and there we look at 63 countries in the EU, and every year we try to assess how good or bad they're doing in terms of climate action. We are doing the CCPI now since 20 years, so this year when we publish the CCPI it will be the 20th edition, so we have quite a long time that we can look back to. And the countries that we look up are together responsible for more than 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so we do have quite a good coverage in countries. And this is what the result of the last edition looked like, and without going into too much detail, you can see that we leave the first 3 ranks empty, as no country, or at least no country that we are looking at, is doing enough to prevent dangerous climate change. We have Denmark in the front for a few years now, and in the back we see fossil fuel heavy countries like Russia, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, or Iran. But I would rather not spend too much time explaining you this ranking, because on Wednesday we will publish the CCPI 2025, so the latest edition, and this is a warmly invitation to come to Nathavan in Area D, where we present at 9 a.m. the newest edition of the CCPI, but you also can follow the press conference online. If you want to have more information about the CCPI, make sure you visit our website, ccpi.org, and there you can find a lot of additional country information and blog posts, also one blog post of Ellie now, and yes, and also the link to the press conference on Wednesday. Normally I first explain the methodology and then show the results. This time I did it the other way around. But let's take a look on how we build the index. We basically look at 4 categories: GHG emissions, renewable energy, energy use and climate policy. The global greenhouse gas emissions category accounts for 40%, so has the biggest part in our ranking. We look into 14 indicators. and we calculate 3 of the 4 categories, so for emissions, renewable energy, and energy use, with the help of quantitative data, and only the climate policy category, we do a qualitative survey where we ask every year 450 country experts that they should assess the climate performance of their country. And so this is a little bit of what the CCPI also makes unique, that we have conduct our own study and where we include the qualitative side of national climate politics experts. But today is about GHG emissions, so let's take a closer look at what is the GHG emissions category about. You can see that we look at 4 indicators. We look at the current level per capita, we look at the past trend, so looking back to the last 5 years. And what we do then is that we also can see whether our countries are in line with the Paris targets. And for each country, we calculate a Paris-compatible pathway starting in 1990. And so we can say, on the one hand, whether a country's current level of GHG emissions per capita is on a Paris-compatible pathway. And on the other side, we can also say whether the 2030 target of the country is on a Paris-compatible pathway. So this was a little bit of a rush through the CCPI methodology, but if you want to learn more about the CCPI, also about this methodology, visit our website. So I would like to move to the question why the military emission gap is a topic for us or for the CCPI. And when we look at the bigger picture, accurate data helps setting effective climate targets. And ambitious targets are an important basis for implementing sufficient climate mitigation measures. So basically, if we do not know how much emissions we actually have to reduce, both targets and implementations could likely be inaccurate to prevent dangerous climate change. At the same time, accurate data help tracking the progress towards goals or targets like, for example, the Paris Agreement. And the CCPI is one instrument that tracks progress, and therefore it needs a solid database. And the military emission gap could lead to an underestimation of emissions for certain countries and ultimately lead to a change in our ranking. And I did a very small exercise to get more insights into the questions, what would happen to the country ranking if we would, or if we could include military action emissions. And yeah, this is the result of my little exercise. Here you can see the 10 countries with the highest military expenditures, and this can be used as a proxy to estimate that these countries also have high emissions in the military action sector. And when we look at the placements of these 10 countries in the CCPI, we see that many of the top 10 countries also have high military expenditures, and they rank poorly in the CCPI. So this is the case for the US, for Russia, for Saudi Arabia, for South Korea, and for Japan. And in the case of these 5 countries, we can speculate that when we would include GHG military emissions, that they would still be very low. I mean, there's not much room to go way more below, but nonetheless, it is also important that they know their real numbers, because only then they can refine their climate goals and measures. And I think it becomes a little bit more interesting when we look at the 2 countries in the list that has a high in the CCPI, which would be India and Germany. Let's talk first about India. Although India is the 3rd biggest emitter worldwide, we look in the CCPI at the GHG per capita emissions. And the per capita emissions in India are still very low, like around 2.2 tons CO2 equivalent. And that's the main reason why India is also very, very high in the ranking. But at the same time, the data accessibility score that the Observatory calculated, India receives a poor, meaning that their emissions are at the moment not transparent and not displayed in their national inventory. So it could be that when we include the military emissions, that India could drop a few places in the ranking. When we look at Germany, the data accessibility score gets a fair, which is the second best category, but also Germany has some gaps in their emission reporting, so it is likely that also Germany could drop a few places in the ranking. And then we have two countries left, which would be the UK and France. They would also probably lose some ranks in the CCPI if we include military emissions, and they, as they both countries have a poor data accessibility score. So my last slide would be my conclusion. I mean, this exercise was highly speculative because it's a difficult word, because like we don't have accurate data to actually do a calculation of the CCPI with the military emissions, but it shows that it would affect likely our ranking. And I would highlight that indices try to display the reality, and we all know that it's impossible to show the reality, but what we can do is that we can have a look from a very specific angle and try to describe him as good as we can, and therefore solid databases are very, very crucial. So accurate databases are important to set accurate targets and implement meaningful measures, but also are vital to track progress, and also the CCPI needs or the success factor of the CCPI is that we do have good databases, so we would highly benefit from a closing of the military emission gap. And I would go back to you, Ellie, for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really very clear message there. Thank you. Clear message there on the need for transparency to really have this comprehensive overview of quite how far our climate action is taking us. We'll now open up the floor to questions from yourselves. You have a panel of experts here, and I'd really love to know the thoughts and questions that their contributions have prompted in you all. So please do raise your hand if you have a question. If you could please wait for the microphone, which I hope will be around. Introduce yourself before you ask your question, and also ideally be aware of how long your contributions are so that we can have as much time for everyone if possible. And are we also able to get Linsey? I know your camera's not working, but in the...
No, I've got it working now, I think. Can you see me?
Oh, amazing. let's find out. We'll leave it with the tech guys and see. Can we get Linsey on the screen rather than me? But in the meantime, yes, I think there was a hand at the front over here. If you have your question to address to a specific panelist, please say, but if you can wait for the microphone, please.
Regarding all topics are very interesting and very important. Some of them are addressing policing with military. I would recommend distinguishing both, because according to lots of legal framework, usually law enforcement is part of internal security, and it's distinguished from military activity. But I would, I respect the preference of including them, but I would highly recommend separating them. Regarding the CCPI methodology, with Germany ranking high and fair, does this include a selective data set, which is 2024, 2023, and recent, or does it include historic emission, including World War I, World War II, and other battlefields globally in Asia, Africa, etc.? And does it also include the scope 3, which is the emission caused by financial aid and military aid to other countries, such as Israel and Ukraine? Or is it only selective for the direct emission of the military activity of German army? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So for the CCPI 2024 that I just presented here, we use greenhouse gas emissions from 2023 for the current share, but we also include calculations from 1990 onwards, so we do not include like World War I, World War II emissions, and we look at production-based emissions in the CCPI, so we stay really in the country and not look outside of the country.
If I could just add on to that as well, to abuse my position as moderator, if someone did want to take into consideration the impact of previous wars or even ongoing wars, there would not be the data to do so because of these historic military emissions reporting gap. So I think hopefully between this event and also the last event, you start to understand quite the scale of the lack of data that is facing us here. And also if I could remind people to please introduce themselves and kind of where you're from as well. Thank you very much. Any further questions? Oh, they're all. So yeah, there was a hand at the back there, please.
Right. Hi, I'm Tomohiro Oda. I'm representing the Optical Society. There are people working on the optics and photonics. Coming from the academics, I was wondering the role of the academics, also maybe in a subnational entity to studying military emission. I have a question to speaker from the Slovenia, also Norway. In your particular case, do you really have to collaborate with a government entity or actually the military department? Or in typical emission study cases, we don't have to have collaboration stuff, you can just study by yourself. But is there any challenges, gaps, or you think that directly collaborating with military department is the best way or not? I'll just leave it there. Thanks so much.
Just to clarify that question, was that about research institutions' collaborations with militaries? With defense? Okay, perfect. Okay. Do you want to go first? Who wants to go?
Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, we very intensively cooperate with science regarding this, and we are motivating our university and scientists to better cooperate also with us. So we have several R&D projects also regarding the calculations and trying to really get the proper pictures of also in the scope 3. So we go back through the LCA analysis also back to the source. And also downstream activities when we are talking about the disposal of military equipment and so on. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I would just add on that. It's same situation in Norway. There are so many issues on first of all compiling a greenhouse gas inventory and then mitigation modeling is like as we have talked about, scope 3 emissions are vast and data are very much lacking. So yeah, there are many research and development projects for the MODs with the academia. So yeah, I hope it answers your questions.
So just pulling up then, this type of emission data is pretty, compared to the other data set we are using for greenhouse gas emission inventory, there's sensitivity. So that's why I'm asking, is the best way to collaborate directly to the basically government entity, or is there any way for us to, the academic to work to contribute to the better assessment?
Excuse me, are you talking about the confidentiality of the data?
Yes, that's a challenge for us.
Okay, yeah, that's the challenge for the scientists to cooperate with the defense. Aggregated data, I'm claiming that there is no secrecy. There is no confidentiality. It might be on the different levels, so on the lower levels, on the units or so on, but aggregated data on the national level, also for the defense, I'm claiming, there is no secrecy, there is no confidentiality. And if somebody is saying that there is a confidential data, that's not. So, if we are working with the scientists, we are giving them this data that is no confidential. So then it is open for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was another hand possibly over here. Was there a hand? Yes, go to the lady first and then to the gentleman at the front.
Hello, my name is Sara Neubavar. I'm a journalist from Slovenia. So we are talking about this big issue. You said like officially it's 5.5%, so unofficially it's more than that. And we are talking about that in a small side event. Why is this not a part of negotiations?
Very good question.
For all of you, yeah.
We'll take the question at the front as well, and then we'll bring these back to our panelists.
Hi, Ganesh Kumar from India. Two questions. Number one, whatever data you presented, again, I know it's a decarbonization, but it's all focused only on carbon side of it. Why we aren't measuring all the environmental impacts like emission to air, emission to water, etc. Because it's only carbon we are measuring. I don't know whether research includes other impacts and life cycle assessment also. Number two is I also see the disposal waste is not mentioned anywhere. For example, you buy equipment, but what happens to the equipment after usage? Military equipments, recycling, disposal, that's not measured in any of the metrics what I see in both the countries. So are you trying to measure your waste equipment, what is it, waste or end of the life cycle measurement also? Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question was why military missions not within the negotiations. Linsey, I wonder if you're online. Do you possibly want to speak that?
Yeah, thank you, Ellie, for that. And very much thank you for the question from the audience. And also, before I answer that, can I just thank Robert for his point as well about the security aspects with respect to reporting. And there is this, I mentioned in my presentation, there is this, you often do hear about you can't report the data because it's a security issue, and it's great to hear that from a military person itself saying that that's not the case, and there's the ways that it can be done. And on the point of why is this a side event and why is it not part of your negotiations, completely and utterly agree with you. This is what we've been working at for the last few years. Is we're on a low point, and in the fact that there wasn't recognition of what the actual contribution was. People are recognising that this is significant, and we know obviously from the impacts of the wars that are happening, there's also the added impact of how militaries and conflicts themselves impact the environment. So yes, absolutely, indeed, it should be part of the proper negotiations and not just sidelined into events like this as a side event. And you also asked about recycling aspect, I think it was, and that again, it's part of a Scope 3 category, so it should in fullness be incorporated into that with respect to how militaries consider their emissions. And you made the other point about just being about carbon. Well, yes, again, I agree with you. Carbon and greenhouse gas emissions are kind of a useful proxy for us to kind of to start to focus on what the much broader environmental impacts of military activities and conflicts are. And as Sam was pointing out about, Norway have been doing a lot of data collection more broadly on contamination and other hazardous waste materials linked with militaries as well. So again, yes, there's a lot more work to be done and transparency around the wider impacts of military activities as well. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Linsey. Would anyone, any other panel, hang on, I keep turning to this side. So anyone over here want to address any of those? Yep. No, then in which case.
Very shortly regarding the recycling. For sure today we were not able to explain everything, but there are many projects also on the recycling of uniforms, of iron, rare materials, on all kinds of stuff. There are many projects running also on that part. Regarding the waste, as Linsey also mentioned, and that our calculation of Scope 3, you could see that there we are very good aware about what waste we are producing, and also we are aware of the emission factors. So the calculation there is very precise. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Go for it.
Yeah, so regarding the first question, why it's not part of the negotiation, I think it also has to do with the fact that it has been difficult enough for states to agree on the Paris Agreement, to go all this way to the Paris Agreement, and probably the security and defense area where was highly sensitive and very political, and as complicated the geopolitical landscape became, as difficult I think it has become to deal with this question on a state level. I think it has also had an impact, the fact that for a long time the question of environment and climate has been very much defined through a development lens and much less through a security lens. It is only since a few years that climate security has become a framing for climate action. And that's how I explain to myself why the military and the security sector at large, because my organization thinks it's not only the military, it's more than that, are not part of a states agreement within UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and we also think it should become part of it. And to the second question, we also think that we need to have a broader framework of dealing with military and the security sector's impact on climate mitigation with the areas where it has an impact and where it may have a positive contribution, provided that the states would do their homeworks, and then the security, the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of the Defense, and so on will do that as well. And I think environmental conservation is, for instance, one area too. Not only the waste, but that's as well. The way in which the military is doing training activities, for instance, it's also very important, and there is a lot of space for improvement. It's not only about the weaponry and the logistics of the military. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And just to add on ever so slightly, use my position as moderator once more. To your points about being missing from negotiations, there's a very intentional exemption within the Kyoto Protocol, which the aftermath of which this is. But that doesn't mean that that can't be unpicked and changed.
How can you change? How can we change it? How can it come regardless of negotiations next year, next fall? If we saw that General Secretary of NATO said there's no way to come to net zero emissions without the ministry.
Completely agree. In the interest of having more voices, there is a hand at the back.
Hi, thank you very much for this work. Linsey Cook with the Quaker United Nations Office. We are observers at the IPCC as well as here, and we have been raising military emissions in the IPCC for a number of years. My question is really to our two states at the panel. Because this is a state-led process in both spaces, we have not heard a state ask for military emissions to be included. And with these latest statistics of over 5%, what we need to hear as observers is states requesting for that information to be brought in. And the main point in the IPCC is that our modeling is therefore off. If we are not including those emissions, then what scientists are saying to us of how much time we have is actually insufficient. So it becomes a scientific concern as well as a political concern. I just wanted to raise that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linsey. So then there was a question here, and then there was another question. So there's a microphone already, but then there's also another question, this gentleman here. Thank you.
My name is Åsa Møller Hansen. I am from WILP, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and we are a part of Women and Gender constituency. And we say that the militarism is the elephant in the room. And we really mean it, because we see that what's happening in these days is that there is a very big increase in military spending. It's an arms race. And international physicians to prevent a nuclear war and other institutions, they made a report not long ago. It was called Climate Crossfire, how NATO's 2% spending targets contribute to climate breakdown. That's quite strong words, but they have kind of documented very well what they are talking about in this report. It's a quite elaborated report, so go into different aspects of this. Yeah, we see a big increase in military exercises, and like in Norway, we have been campaigning against the military bases, American bilateral agreements with Norway, to have military bases in Norway. And I ask, who will count the emissions from the military bases and from the military exercises, when you know that there are maybe hundreds of fighter jets and other military aircrafts for a week in the air, and we know that F-35 is spending 5,600 liters per hour of jet fuel. So who will count these emissions from the exercises and from the military bases? Thank you.
Thank you. So that was sort of 1 point and 1 question. I don't know if anyone wishes to come back on whether we could see states advocating at the UNFCCC and at the IPCC for better reporting emissions, and then also the second question around, really important question around who is accounting for military training exercises, and also the point around overseas military bases. So I don't know if anyone would like to... Norway first?
Yeah, I can try to answer on that. I can only answer on the Norwegian side, and so our greenhouse gas inventory is for the Norwegian MOD boat. It doesn't have a geographical boundary, right? So it's both national emissions, but also when there are contributions internationally. We have reported on that in the past for emissions from Afghanistan and Mali and so on and so forth. So for our side, this is an organizational greenhouse gas inventory on our side. But it's a good point when there are large exercises with many countries. It is important that that is reported. But at the moment, this is for each country to report their own emissions. But then they need to disclose those emissions. So.
Can I jump in as well, Ellie?
We'll take, Linsey, you go, and then we'll come back to Robert.
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, thank you, Simon, for that point. It's an emission in the NATO's. I mentioned about their greenhouse gas methodology as well, but the fact that they specifically mention in accounting for their own greenhouse gas emissions is that it doesn't include emissions from their own operations and training activities. So that's again puts it down to how our countries actually do it themselves, and it's not consistent across different countries how they're doing that. For example, Germany's submission for this year explicitly states that they've not included the emissions from those kind of activities, training activities with NATO, for example. So it is a very important point to make that those need to be incorporated and making sure it's not missed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. As Simon mentioned, we are not geographically limited. So everything what we produce, we calculate all these emissions. And we should point out also for the deployment. So when we are participating at the United Nations missions, where we set the camps, we also calculate emissions of this for good cause basis. And we need to do our job. So we need to exercise back home that we can do that job when we are deployed, but everything is there included. On the other hand, we should also ask ourselves what we are doing in decreasing that. This F-35 is already flying with synthetic fuel. So there are experiments, there are R&D activities to completely decrease this carbon footprint. So it takes time, it takes a lot of money. And also, this R&D money is included in this 2% that you mentioned before. So yes, it's a problematic, it's time-consuming, but money-consuming a lot, and for sure it is not limited to our countries, so when we are deployed. On the other hand, we should also ask ourselves, United Nations organizations have more than 500 camps, also humanitarian camps and so on. And all these camps are running on the diesel fuel. How we are dealing that question? Thank you.
Thank you. We had another question here at the front.
Yeah, thank you. This is Jan Brook from German Watch. I have a question to Norway, Slovenia. You're both NATO partners. Do you have any idea how the NATO will develop, especially when you look at the elections that just happened in the US? So regarding this question of accounting, being account for military missions.
We don't know, but I would think the US has reported previously, but I think CEOBS are more aware of these numbers than me personally. So, yeah.
I'm not able to comment on that. Thank you.
Linsey, I wonder whether you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, obviously the US are the biggest military spending nation, around about, I think is it 0.9 trillion, or pushing to that now. So yeah, they're obviously very significant. They do reporting, but it's fuel use based. So, well, scope 1 and scope 2, they're not have yet published substantially any scope 3 reporting. And also I think it was in 2022 there was an executive order for federal departments to actually start disclosing their scope 3 emissions. Unfortunately, there was a I think it was called, I can't remember what it's called now. Yeah, the National Defence Authorization Act, which has delayed that for defence contractors from reporting to the end of this year. So that's already been delayed. So it's probably looking quite unlikely that there'll be a requirement for defence contractors to actually start disclosing scope 3 emissions for the defence sector. So it's potentially not looking great, but we still need to obviously push and advocate for that to take place, because the US is obviously such a huge contributor to the emissions with respect to military. Thank you.
Thanks, Linsey. I think we probably have time for one more question and a hand shot up immediately. So over there, please. Thank you. And yeah, a big thank you to the volunteer who is running around with the microphones. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm Davor. I'm with IRCAI, which would have been the UNESCO AI Center in Slovenia again. Thank you for the panelists, and special thank you to our colleague from Slovenia, from the MOD. I was curious for the last question, taking into regard all of the comments, if both militaries would have unlimited resources in terms of funding, but also personnel and so on, would you be able to articulate a blue sky project that you would sort of like run for a year or maybe 2 and then showcase at COP in 2 years or 1 year? So a blue sky project in terms of this topic.
Sounds like an on-the-spot funding bid. Anyone want to come in?
Yeah, we have many projects implementing renewables, also converting this and storing energy in hydrogen, then converting it back to electricity. There are, I don't know, ideas about using nuclear power on different way, so for the electricity. There are possibilities, or also many possibilities, but as I mentioned before, you need a lot of time and a lot of money to do so. So we are more than aware that our activities are causing emissions, mainly because of consuming the fuels. So we are looking into the direction to change that fuel to the, let's say, no emission fuels, like synthetic fuels, like hydrogen or something like that. It is possible, but it takes time. We should understand, when we buy the equipment, we buy it for 40 years, not like we are buying a car for 3 years and then exchanging it. No. For 40 years or maybe more, because none of military is so rich to change the equipment so fast. But also with old equipment, we can maybe power it on different way, without emissions and so on. So there are activities, and yes, it's good that we talk about it, but we should all understand that we need to do our job, and we would like to do it good, and we need to do it good. So, and we are really keen also to contribute to the common goals. Thank you.
So yeah, your Blue Sky project would be something on energy.
Yes, for sure, energy related and recycling and so on. Thank you.
In which case, I think that brings us to an end. So a massive thank you to our panel. I think that you put forward a really strong case as to why transparent military missions reporting is really so vitally needed, and to our military representatives who have shown what is possible with ambition and political will, importantly. Now, civil society plays a really critical role in driving forward both ambition and political will, and I ask that those of you who are here continue to raise awareness of this intersection within your communities and within your delegations in your countries. And to those who have joined us from the defence community, thank you for your curiosity. I hope that this event has highlighted that thorough and transparent military missions reporting isn't just possible, but is frankly essential at this point to decarbonise the sector. It's no time for excuses now, so look forward to working together on this and very much welcome conversations outside of this room. Thank you.